Top news today, of course, is Bitcoin is on the move. Today, we're going to break that down. My name is Paul Barron. This is TechPath. Let's jump into it today. Listen, there are a lot of things that are happening this week with Bitcoin. Obviously, as you guys know, if you're watching this channel, you probably understand where El Salvador is positioned now that it's a legal tendered currency. They're in a country and the likelihood of maybe making some domino moves across the wake of South America, along with many other things that are going on. And we're going to break all those things down. I want to just remind you on these market movers that we do. We put a bunch of research together. We take a look at where the news is trending, where social and sentiment is moving, and then we bring that in and kind of mesh it all together for you guys. Remember, this is not investment advice. If you are a short-term investor, I just had this conversation with one of our producers. If you're a short-term investor, you need to follow the candles. You need to do your own research. You've got to be able to put together a layer of tool sets before you make an investment. That's the number one thing. Always also take a look at multiple sources because it's very important, I think, that you understand where all of it's going. We do this on a day in, day out basis, really diving into it. We look at all these kind of things and then we make our best estimates and approaches of where things are going. Okay, so let's jump over to the Decrypt story you saw today. Of course, banks must cover Bitcoin holdings with own capital. This is going to be the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has announced that banks must set aside enough capital to cover Bitcoin losses. Here's the key thing, in full. This is where I think it gets really, really interesting when you look at where the potential for organizations like this start to come into play. Because if banks are really restricted on being able to do activities, whether it's doing an exchange for crypto or utilizing crypto and or the blockchain in any way within the banking organization, the capacity of being able to fund crypto assets, in other words, you have to keep the equal amount in reserve at all times. I think this is going to start separating the big banks from the small banks very quickly. That is not a good thing for cryptocurrency because this will limit the number of players and it will start to centralize. As we all know, this is a decentralized model for all kinds of monetary formulas, but it will start to centralize potentially cryptocurrency and some of the additional altcoins moving into most likely the bigger banks. So I think that's going to be a big one. One thing that they kind of note on, which is the first refers to tokenized and traditional assets and stablecoins like Tether. Banks can class these under the same rules as bonds, loans, and commodities and equities. So that's one thing that is good, is that the stablecoins will at least be able to be in the same kind of asset class as bonds and loans and other commodities. But the latter group right here, and I want to highlight that for you. The latter group right here is, of course, traditional cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. These assets will be now subject to what they call the conservative prudential treatment, meaning they will carry a risk weighting of 1,250%. In simple terms, this means any bank that holds Bitcoin or an equivalent crypto asset will have to hold capital in at least a value to their exposure. I've got $1 million in exposure. I've got to have $1 million in solid fiat and or traditional equities assets in this. So I do think this is going to slow things down a bit. And it's, in reality, I wouldn't call this FUD for cryptocurrency in general. And in fact, I think it goes back to some of the regulatory scenarios that we in the crypto space that we've been talking about over the past few weeks, months, and even years, is that we need a little bit more clarity in the regulation. I think in the early days, which is where we are, remember, this is very early in all of where these digital assets are moving. The early days, I think we are going to see overreaction and overcorrection in many cases. For those of you who are in it for the long haul, this is probably just a blip on the radar, but it gets you going in the right direction. And I think that's the big thing that kind of plays into this. I also want to jump to another story they did right here. And I'm going to zoom over to this one. Bitcoin up 6%. As you guys know, Bitcoin is flying today as we record this on the June 10th. Bitcoin up 6% amid the fastest rise in consumer price since the financial crisis. So basically what this is saying is that our situation around inflation is real. And the fact that we've seen inflation to the tune really of since the last financial crisis, 2007 and 8. This is a big scenario that could play into an opportunity for Bitcoin and or cryptocurrency becoming a hedge solution. So I want to kind of show you a chart here if you look at it. But the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported today a 5% rise since the last year in Consumer Price Index, CPI, reviving inflation fears again. This just reported. This is the fastest year-over-year rise since the housing burst in 2008. At the same time, the index rose 5.3%. And Bitcoin, often heralded as the hedge against, is up 6.6% over the last 24 hours. So you can kind of see the movement quickly of where that occurred. Now, when you look at CPI, and this is something that, I've been looking at CPI since 1980 when I was in, high school and studying this. And the idea, and remember, in 1980, we had a 13.5% inflation, probably one of the highest in the last 100 years. And part of that, as you looked at the economy and what kind of rolling effects that had on it, it did start to affect a lot of the capital markets. The big concern I have here with CPI is if this starts to affect some of the traditional markets, even though I do feel like Wall Street and the traditional investment instruments and traditional investment tools are not necessarily being affected. I feel like they almost are on an island in the sense of where the market is moving. CPI is interesting because I feel like this should be affecting Wall Street, but it doesn't seem to have the kind of effect on it that it has had in the past. If Wall Street does not start to see major sell-offs, I feel like cryptocurrency is going to continue to align with it. But I do think as an asset class, now that whether you agree with me or not, it is an asset class that most likely is aligned much closer to Wall Street than we all think. So that's a big one. And I want to kind of jump back to where this might be going. And one of the things I wanted to look at was this token summary right here. Now this is, of course, if you guys go to CoinMarketCap, you can kind of pull this, but mainly what I did was I screenshotted this morning to take a look at the holders making money at current price, 75%. So this right here tells me a lot on where this is going. And I'm pretty amazed that it was that high in this particular scenario. The other thing that still surprises me on Bitcoin, and this goes back to some videos we've done on ETH, the flippening, is that the concentration by large holders is only 12%. This is a bit of a concern because it does mean, obviously, as you guys know, all the whales moving in and or holding that position, and that's really kind of what's propping up Bitcoin at this point. Summary is it still is showing bearish, even though we are seeing a lot of positive data. And I want to jump to, hang on one second, we'll jump over to Trade the Chain just to see where Bitcoin is on sentiment. Let's move over to Trade the Chain just so you can kind of see. This is active right now as we're filming at 36.6. And you can kind of, I've got this out on the 7-day, and I wanted to jump to this so you can kind of see where it's pumping right here. You saw this on June 7th. We were seeing the 36 to 37 move. Here was where the sentiment basically was kind of supporting that. And then boom, there was the nice little correction for this week down to 31. And then we saw this rise. And of course, as it was rising, the sentiment, of course, stays with it. Now, whether you believe in sentiment or not, the key is that sentiment plays into a factor in an asset class like cryptocurrency. And there's two reasons. One is that you're going to have, first of all, is the fundamentals are not traditionally backed by performance, other than what you get on the project performance. So that's usually going to be media driven and news driven, which also feeds into the sentiment layer that starts to ramp and amplify the potential opportunity for any kind of thing. And we're going to talk about that. But as you can kind of see, sentiment holding up right here in the green, and you see a little bit of a rise in it right here on the end. I want to look at this tailing scenario right here as Bitcoin came off its high at almost 38,000, and it moved down just a little bit, and then they started to cross right there at the end. Let's take a look back at Trade the Chain, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about right here. Is where we are. So we're starting to see the price point starting to fall. The question is, again, sentiment will start to layer against that. The key is if sentiment continues up, that's when you start to see flatline and or corrections to continue to go back down. This is why it's important if you're a day trader or you're somebody that's looking for a one-day trade, like, I did a trade this week. I was looking at Bitcoin. I had a certain price point I was going to get exit out of, and it exited me, happened, ended up doing a great trade, got in on a nice little scenario. That's where sentiment can help you, because if you're close enough to it, it gives you the ability to do these short trades. And those are the kinds of ones I think that if you're playing in this market, that's really kind of the play at this time if you're trying to do quick flips. The long-term side of it, when you look at where sentiment and amplification can go, that's where you look at holding much longer. And the key there is you just want to make sure that as you're watching, and this, of course, you can kind of keep track with what's happening in the news, but you have to be careful, because sometimes the FUD that's coming at us from the number of news sources often sometimes will have effects, and in some cases start to move against it. Now there has been some coins that have not necessarily followed sentiment lines and even amplification lines. Amplification meaning once a sentiment starts to move on a particular topic, there is going to be a certain amplification. Amplification is based on the number of people talking about it. So it's the same water cooler effect that you have on social media and you've had on social media for the past decade. But even more so, this works in stocks. It's been working around the stock market for years, and it works fairly well. The difference is that you have the data, both quant data and also financial data, to support those positions. That's why it's a little bit less volatile, where in the blockchain, you do not have that as much. Now, there are some companies that are moving into more quant data, which is basically blockchain data sets that will start to reveal, I think, some more analysis tools, which I think in the future, as we start to see this product really evolve, both from a machine learning standpoint and also an AI standpoint, these are some things that we're definitely going to be able to see in the future and really kind of moving forward. All right, so I want to jump over here to TradingView, and basically what we did was we took a look at some of the amplification and where the sentiment was. So this is actually reporting on historical data. So it's taking a look backwards in time. Where did sentiment fall? How did the amplification affect it? And where did it end up? And in most cases, what we were seeing as the sentiment was in its positioning at 49.61 back on 5/8, we had an amp score of 39.28. These are out of 100. 100 would be amplification to the moon. It doesn't happen, but just to give you guys an understanding. So lower amplification right here, and you can kind of see the downward trend, and it aligns right in with the movement. That's where it kind of fell off, and this is where amplification will either, one, correct, or continue the fall. So that's a big scenario to watch, and that's exactly what happened here. We didn't score that one, but then you look at this little blip right here where Bitcoin actually started to correct a little bit on 526 after the big price correction. And where did the amplification went? It went sideways. So this is a scenario, again, 39 right there, and a 35 right here, amplification going sideways. Sentiment here on 6/8 drops to 53, or up to 53, and amplification starts to rise again. And this is exactly where we are right now. What does this mean? Could we see a 40K in July? This is a possibility now with Bitcoin. If you look at amplification measurements and kind of where it's been going and coming from in the past, and what that might mean, as long as we don't get the traditional scenarios of where we get influential scenarios kind of blowing up, the crypto universe. I think it's less and less affected, and we're seeing less and less effect on the cycles of Bitcoin for it to be able to hold over 30 the way it has during this big correction. I've actually been a bit impressed with it, because I anticipated in the beginning that we would see a Bitcoin correction, and have been prepared for a Bitcoin correction, maybe down in the 20K range. So for it to actually hold out a little stronger, I'm very interested to see, and still am not convinced that this bull run is over, but am definitely watching it very closely to see how long this sustains out. If this is a summer, a kind of a dark summer before we see any kind of life, that could be the case, but I feel like July could be where the fireworks happen for Bitcoin, especially if we don't see the continued rise of ETH. ETH is a real scenario in terms of where investment is going. Now, I think it will still be early, and again, we're talking about mostly retail investors and to a certain extent some institutional, but I don't think we're going to see institution moving in heavily in the summer. It's usually an off period for Wall Street in doing something like this. And I still think we've got to have some banks getting involved at a much more deep level before we start to see that institution shift occur. Whether maybe you should take a look at our Kathy Wood video, because Kathy Wood has really kind of broken down why she believes Bitcoin could hit 500K, where it's going to come from, and what that timeline could be. Even though that we still talk to a lot of people today that still look at the 100K mark as being the price point, the price target for Bitcoin this year in 2021. It's going to be fun to look at this video in about a year, see if we were right and or if we were absolutely wrong. I feel like we're in the right trend for this, so it's definitely one that we're obviously watching. So Bitcoin holders, you guys, you know the drill. HODL is the plan. I think a lot of long-term investors like myself really are looking at this as a much longer investment timeline and horizon than a lot of people today. And I feel like when I talk to a lot of my friends and people in kind of the early age or days of crypto investing for their particular experiment, I feel like even though Bitcoin, hey, listen, if you're looking long, you've got to go the Bitcoin and Ethereum route. If you are looking short, you've got to start to analyze what's happening in these projects, because the project coins are the ones where the movement is happening. And if you are looking short term, I just would suggest that, just check out some of the other, we do it here. There's a ton of great content out here on YouTube that really kind of moves into what is happening in the altcoins. So I would love to hear from you. If you have an altcoin you think, hey, let's do an analysis on, let's take a little bit deeper dive into the project. And in some cases, we'll bring the founders on and have them in an interview so you can really dive into their mindset of where the altcoin market for that particular project is going. And that, I think, is what reveals some very hot coins and some big winners over the past few days, which we'll definitely be doing a video on those coming up. So make sure and stay tuned right here. If you're on the podcast, subscribe, give us some stars. And if, of course, you're over here on YouTube, the number one thing you can do right now, smash the like button. Hit that big thumb and then subscribe to the channel. It's the best way you can help us. And it's also a good way if you want to share what we're talking about. We cover everything from crypto, obviously tech. We go deep into EVs, AI, autonomy, robotics, all things like drone delivery for restaurants. I mean, we get into really where tech is going in the future. And of course, if you have an idea for the show, just send us a note to producer@revernetworks.com. You can catch me on Twitter @PaulBaron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.